I think the truth is outside of the mayors, and maybe even better than them, who's made a difference in climate? And it is advocacy coming from youth. Greta Thunberg calling out Donald Trump put climate back on the map globally as an issue. And because it was a global issue, it empowered those who were trying to act. And yes, it hasn't been enough. And we have to do more really quickly. But I think the voice of your generation is unbelievably powerful.
So today we have the incredible opportunity to interview David Miller. He has been the mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010, chair of C40 Cities from 2008 to 2010, and he's the author of Solved, How the World's Greatest Cities Are Fixing the Climate Crisis. So you have had a big impact in terms of emission reduction in the city of Toronto, and have used the opportunity to work firsthand with other cities to implement policies that have worked elsewhere. Thank you for joining us. This is Manga and Tristan from Prologue Magazine.
Thanks very much for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Sure. So just for our viewers, we want to give you a little context as to what Prologue Magazine is. Prologue Magazine is an independent architecture and design magazine run by the students of IE, and the magazine has historically explored issues related to the built environment and to the domains beyond and related. And so the current edition, which is still under construction, is focused on taking stock of the ambience of many of the existential issues we are arguably up to our necks in, from AI, the breakdown of democracy across the globe, and of course, climate change. And so by ambience, we mean how these crises are communicated, to who they're communicated, and to what end. And in doing so, we want to understand the anxieties of our generation a little bit in more sort of complexity. We've spoken to architects, we've interviewed artists, we've spoken to urbanists, students, and now you, Mr. Miller. And perhaps to start off lightly, giving more context, this year has had flooding in New York, wildfires across Europe, the flooding of the Great African Lakes, flooding in Greece, Turkey, northern China, superlative temperatures year after year. Antonio Guterres, the SG of the UN, refers to global warming as global boiling. Climate change is now being referred to as climate collapse. My question, Mr. Miller, is, are you an optimist?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I have a privileged viewpoint. I'm lucky in my professional life. I work with mayors of many of the world's great cities. And the reason I wrote the book was to tell their story, because they're actually taking action against climate change that works, that makes their cities better places to live. And if we can take the best ideas and do them everywhere, we can make the change that's needed to get us on track. But I'm also deeply worried, because the reality is we have about 6 years left. And if we cannot get on a path that more or less halves emissions by 2030, we're going to see the beginnings of climate change get much worse really quickly. That's what science tells us. I'm hopeful because we can do that. I'm worried because we're not doing it enough at scale. Cities, nobody's doing more than cities, but nobody's doing enough either. And from a Canadian perspective, our country was literally on fire this year. It was the worst wildfire season we've ever had, and it became the worst wildfire season right at the beginning. It was so bad. And the smoke from Canada was not only visible in New York and Philadelphia and Washington and Boston, the east coast of the U.S., it created health and other hazards from thousands of kilometers away. So we've seen it firsthand. Yeah. And it's deeply worrying. But yes, am I hopeful? Yes.
Fantastic.
Sure. So as the former chair of C40 Cities, You've been involved in collaborative efforts among mayors from major cities to combat climate change. Can you share some successful initiatives or strategies that have emerged from these partnerships?
Yeah, the interesting thing about cities, from my perspective, is that in about 2008 or 2009, depending on whose figures you use, for the very first time in human history, the world became an urban world from the perspective that more people lived inside cities than outside.
Mm.
So from the dawn of human civilization till 15 years ago, more people lived in rural areas than cities. Today, more people live in cities. And so if you look at the numbers and the science, about today, 55%, and it's growing, of the population lives in cities. Most of the economy is in cities, and about 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions are there. And those are in four sectors: how we heat, cool, and build our buildings, transportation, how we manage our waste, and how we generate our electricity. The biggest part in those sectors. Food matters too, but the big emissions. And there are initiatives in all of those areas: transportations, buildings, waste, how we generate our electricity. So I can give a few. Los Angeles, for example, about 10 years ago, when the former mayor Eric Garcetti was first elected, nine years ago, their electricity was about 30% coal and significant gas. Based on his plan, by 2031, according to outside studies, their electricity will be completely green, clean, no greenhouse gas emissions. It's an extraordinary transformation in a very short period of time. Transportation, Shenzhen in China, it's completely electrified its bus fleet. It's got 16,000 buses. It has, or is about to, completely electrify taxis and rideshare vehicles. And it's used that as an industrial strategy to create jobs. So it's got the right idea. We solve climate and create jobs at the same time. Very interesting initiatives around waste management, particularly in some African cities, where methane release from informal landfills are probably the biggest source of greenhouse gases in some American cities. And by making those informal landfills formalized, you have a real chance to capture the methane and stop the pollution. So there are initiatives like this and many more in those sectors. Buildings is the most important, and it's sometimes not as interesting. And people talk about transportation, electric cars, electric buses, building public transport. But buildings, how we build them, where we build them, are they located in ways that allow people to walk and ride bicycles, or do you have to drive cars? That's where the biggest emissions are in most cities. And there are numerous initiatives to make zero emission buildings, some even net positive, to create cities that are denser, 15-minute city ideas, denser, more walkable neighborhoods like in Paris. New York has a whole program to help commercial buildings, in fact, force them to have emissions by 2030. So there are significant initiatives happening somewhere. That's just a few highlights. But I think, the fact that a Chinese city is leading us in electric vehicles should make us all think. If it's possible in Shenzhen, China, why isn't it happening in Madrid? Why isn't it happening in London? Why isn't it happening in Cape Town, for example?
Yeah. And so just to sort of dig into this idea of the city, of course, you've identified it as a sort of artifact or organism that is responsible or has a greater kind of weight in terms of the amount of people that are in cities, and of course the amount of emissions that are emitted. As a kind of political instrument, however, why do you think that this scale of societal organization is the most effective? Like, why not? What are the differences in the kind of political instruments of like cities versus perhaps one scale up, the national, or one scale down, the municipal?
It's a very interesting question. I'm of that view, first of all, because I've seen it work. But I think secondly, if you look at it philosophically, first of all, in many ways, cities predated nations.
Right.
and there were city-states before there were nation-states. So it's a very ancient thing, a city. And I think cities have a legitimacy that's almost permanent in that way. And it gets complicated. What is a city? How do you include the region in that concept of the city? But if you think about the city as having been there and survived different versions of nation states for hundreds of years and grown in organic ways and in deliberate ways, then you start from the idea that there's no more legitimacy to a national government than a city. They may have more power at various times. Today is a moment when national governments tend to have more of the money, for example. They collect income and sales taxes. But the city is equally legitimate as a government. And it also has some unique things that are different than national governments. Most cities have laws, for example, on a development project that you have to engage with the people. So by nature, cities tend to be an order of government that works very directly with people. Secondly, they tend to be an order of government that's practical. Right. You can't debate policies and then not do them, or you don't get reelected.
Right.
Mayors need to deliver. You need to build transit. You need to ensure that people needing opportunity have opportunity. You need to ensure there's equity for low-income neighborhoods, or people will choose somebody else. And the third thing is cities are seeing the impact of climate change today. My own city in Toronto, when I was mayor, our infrastructure was built to a level of 100-year storms. So the level anticipated and predicted of a 100-year storm. But we started to have, in every year that I was mayor, 50-year storms. And that had a huge impact on the infrastructure. And we needed to rebuild new infrastructure, some of it green to accommodate the storms, not all concrete, not all pipes. Our total tax revenue was $3 billion. That infrastructure project alone to deal with the increasing severity and frequency of storms because of climate change was $1 billion. So cities have this unique need to deal with climate change, this unique partnership with the residents, and this unique pragmatism to deliver change. And to me, that's why cities are different than national governments. It's a different proposition. And that's why you see the best cities, not every city, but the best cities actually leading on implementing real change to address the climate catastrophe.
Fascinating.
So, as you have said in the beginning of the interview, we are talking from a perspective from countries or cities that historically have been very developed. So my question is, like, with C40 cities, how can you help cities like Nairobi or Manila in the Philippines, or maybe Lima in Peru? How can we help these kind of cities that maybe the municipal government, there's corruption, or there's these problems where the link between the mayor and the city is not as direct as your case in Toronto or maybe Madrid? So how can we help these cities to become more sustainable?
So first of all, corruption can be anywhere. And when I was elected in Toronto, one of the reasons why I was elected was I and my colleague, the late Ann Johnson, who was a legendary councillor, had exposed a corruption scandal that was so blatant. The elected chair of the budget committee was taking brown paper bags of cash in the City Hall parking garage from people who wanted to do business with the city. I mean, it wasn't even sophisticated corruption, and they caught the guy because he paid for his parking, so they knew when he came. And I mean, it was, if it wasn't so serious and such a betrayal of his oath, it was so pathetic. It was almost funny, but it was really bad. So, I think when I was chair of C40, I sort of had this implicit belief that Toronto was doing such amazing things that I was going to go show others how to do them. And what I learned very quickly is the learning goes both ways. So I would actually turn your question around a little bit and say, what can we learn from other cities like Freetown in Sierra Leone? Very little money. They've got an incredible tree planting program to plant 1 million trees. And I'm pretty certain that nobody in Europe or North America are planting 1 million trees. They've found a way to do it. They call it Freetown, the Tree Town. And there's a whole program, and they're engaging people in informal settlements, and they're hiring them to monitor the trees and plant them. So it's about incomes and about climate mitigation, adaptation. Quezon City in the Philippines, really interesting work during COVID, repurposing industrial land to grow food. It was a big challenge with supply chains cut in COVID. So we can learn both ways. What Toronto is really good at, we're very good at reducing emissions. Toronto's emissions, based on a plan that started in 2007, are now over 30% below what they were in 1990, which is a massive reduction. No country's anywhere close to that, through buildings and transportation and energy and waste. So there's a lesson, but there's creativity. Bogota has interesting public transport, a cable car. Medellin has done a similar thing. So it for me, it goes both ways, and that's one of the hopeful things about cities, is that when you have a global organization where there's good representation from both the North and the South, you can learn from each other. Mm-hmm. There's also real warning signs. Cape Town was a few days away from running out of water.
Mm.
What happens if a city runs out of water? People can't live. You can maybe live without a car. Can't live without water. And so there's, how they dealt with that crisis is a warning for all of us. And there's positive lessons, but pretty scary as well.
Yeah.
Well, these examples are really tied really well with the next question. Last week we had the chance to interview Adrian Ghosh, which is the founder and leading architect at Weststate. His studio has been working on the design and construction of Toronto's Lakefront Park, which it has been a breakthrough project in the city. He, when we talked to him, he talked about the democratization of the city. What do you think about these huge projects that involved a lot of construction during years? What is your point of view into democratizing a city?
It's a really important question. I'm glad you asked it, because for me, the reason I have hope in city governments is because they are democratic, not just in the sense of voting. Maybe not everybody votes in some places, but in the sense that their operations and decisions have to engage people, sometimes by law, sometimes just because it's habit. So if you look at Toronto's waterfront, it's a very interesting example. It's a huge project. Huge. I can't remember the exact figures, but it's hundreds of hectares. And it stretches 3 or 4 kilometers east-west, right along downtown, where there used to be piers for industrial activity, and then past the mouth of the Don River, and south another kilometer or two. And that entire area was oil tank farms, very heavily polluted land. It couldn't be redone until new technologies were invented to clean the oil. It was just impossible. And at the heart of it, there's a river, the Don River, a very famous and ancient river, that stops in a concrete canal at a 90-degree turn, because 100 years ago we thought that was a good idea. And so what they're doing in that river is they're rebuilding the estuary, so the river will go out naturally, which means some of the land won't be developable. It'll be part of the river estuary. It'll go out naturally. How did this all come about? It came about because the city didn't just say, we're going to revitalize the waterfront. It said to the people, we have a chance to revitalize the waterfront. Here's some ideas. And what do you think? And the people were extremely engaged in waterfront revitalization. And a lot of the thinking about the river came back from a public movement that was started years before this called Bring Back the Dawn. This river was so polluted, if you put your hand in, you would probably be sick. But now people canoe in it because it's been cleaned up, and it was a public movement, a not-for-profit organized by the people. And one of the reasons the Don was so polluted was because the river couldn't clean itself because it ended at 90 degrees at this wall of concrete. So that movement led to what's there. By contrast, part of the waterfront, after I left office, was to be privatized to Sidewalk Labs, a Google-affiliated company. And that process didn't listen to residents or engage it at the beginning. They said, we're going to do this. What do you think about it? And people said, we don't want that. And eventually they left. And it was because I think the difference between the big project that's going ahead, which is massive, and the sidewalk project, which failed, was the one that's going ahead started with the people and started with this group that had been working for a long time to clean the river, really. It didn't start with ideas of how do we rebuild on these lands. They were there, but it started with ideas, we've got some ideas, let's take them to the people now, rather than saying, we have a project, here's the project, you can comment on the details, but that's all. And people said, we don't want your project. And, Google left. It's like one of the biggest companies in the world, and the activist residents of downtown Toronto made them go away. It's a pretty interesting and very telling about how to make big change and how not to.
Yeah, we have a question related to sort of citizen participation, but we'll get to that later. Very excited for that.
I may have answered it already.
You'll see.
I'll see. Okay.
You'll see. My next question is more to do with the national scale, but I think perhaps the lessons are transferable, maybe. But if we, or rather, you seem to have sort of maintained faith in democratic processes to do with the climate change mitigation and, I guess, adaptation. And if there are any lessons we've learned on the national stage or the global stage, is that sort of these democratic processes can't really be trusted. If we look at the Paris Agreement, some argue that, its promises aren't ambitious enough, and even these unambitious targets aren't being met. If we look at the Kyoto Protocol, these targets weren't met. If we look at the latest COP 27 in Egypt, it was arguably a laughingstock in the sense that more lobbyists were present than politicians. Rishi Sunak didn't even bother to show up. It seems like democracy isn't necessarily good at dealing with these kinds of decisions that need active and swift kind of decision making. But also on the back of that is you have movements like Extinction Rebellion, which aren't necessarily packaged within the democratic framework, and there are more of these kinds of movements showing up and more of them being labeled terrorist organizations. What do you make of this kind of paradigm we're in?
I think the premise of your question is spot on. And for somebody coming from city government, the fact that the Paris Agreement was lauded as a success was bizarre, because the Paris Agreement was at COP 21. So COP is the Conference of the Parties, 21 is 21 years. It took 21 years for national governments to agree on a non-binding, inadequate way to address climate change. I mean, it's really shocking. Yeah. And I can assure you as a mayor, if I said to my residents, look, I know your neighborhood needs new opportunities for young people for jobs, a new community center, a new library, and safe walking because people are being killed because there's no sidewalks by the traffic. And I said, we'll get to it in 21 years. I would not be mayor any longer. I mean, it's preposterous from a city's perspective. You see an issue and you address it. But I don't think it is about the failure of democracy. I deeply believe in democracy. As somebody wanting to run for office, you need to explain to people clearly and inspiringly why they should support you. And I think that's the price of admission. You don't, nobody has a right to be elected. And sometimes the outcomes of elections are ones I disagree with vehemently. But I very fundamentally believe in democracy. I do think it is more than a fair criticism that the international process around climate has failed. And implicitly, the UN Secretary General is admitting this because he called his own climate summit this year. And that summit was about action, and he only invited the national government leaders, the mayors, the governors and premiers of states and provinces, the business leaders and others who are actually acting and making commitments to do their fair share of halving by 2030. And I think that's an implicit admission that the intergovernmental process has failed. I sometimes think if it was cities leading that process, we'd have more practical, pragmatic, and real outcomes. It clearly hasn't worked, and the world is still subsidizing fossil fuels. We're still increasing our consumption in the face of the illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The call was to exploit more gas, not to get off it, so that we didn't need Russian gas, which would be the most logical position. Mayors called for that, European mayors like Mayor Sala from Milan, but not the national governments. And
can I ask, is there a world where cities sort of supersede or can supersede the national framework in
a way?
Yeah.
Because and I think this is what's going on in a way. Cities can have relationships with each other regardless of national government relationships. Toronto, India and Canada right now, and Canada and China both have frosty relationships. But Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver have had long-standing relationships with Indian cities and Chinese cities that continue. Toronto was sister cities with Russian cities during the Soviet Union cities at the time during the Cold War. So there is a way. And I think the way is for cities just to say, here's the path that's going to make our cities better places to live, better places for people from lower incomes, and address climate change. And we're not going to wait. We're going to do it. So one of the examples of that is 2 years ago at the COP in Glasgow, under the leadership of Mayor Garcetti, who was C40's leader, 1,000 cities globally were recruited to the high standards of C40 cities. And they've made the same commitments to doing their fair share of halving by 2030, regardless of whether their national governments are doing it. And there are other issues, like migration and climate migration, where cities are working and not waiting for national governments to act and working together to find solutions to the challenges, and from a perspective that values humanity. So I think the answer to that is yes. I think they can construct and are constructing practical relationships to solve the problems. And really, that's sort of the thesis of my book and the name. But yes.
Fantastic.
It's a really interesting question, though, right?
Appreciate it. My next question, my favorite question, I've been itching to ask.
Is it as interesting as the last one?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. So Jane Jacobs.
Yes.
Perhaps the most famous urbanist in the history of urbanism, or infamous, depending on your politics. You have a sort of personal relationship with her, or had a personal relationship with her, as she was the co-chair of your transition team when you were campaigning in 2003. And you also have a kind of relationship with architects generally. You had Jack Diamond was on your...
You've done your homework.
I've done my homework. I had to do my homework for you. Was on your campaign team as well.
Yeah, he was a co-chair.
My question, first of all, is what was your relationship like with Jane Jacobs? She was seen as a kind of anti-establishment figure, and to have her on the campaign of, you're trying to become legitimate in your city. And then the other question is, what role do you think architects have in this whole, I guess, the mess?
So, Jane Jacobs was formidable. It was, it was an incredible honor to have her support me. And I was very familiar with the life and death of great American cities. She moved, as you know, but just in case some listeners don't, she moved from New York to Toronto and was an icon in Toronto because they wanted to build an expressway right through the middle of the city. The city didn't want it, but the provincial government, the region or the state wanted it. And it was a huge political fight, and she led that fight and won and stopped the expressway going through downtown neighborhoods. And to this day, it's not there and it'll never happen. Well, the beginning of it's there, but the rest of it didn't happen and it won't. In fact, a subway ultimately was built more or less along the route underground. So she's an icon. So to have her supporting me was an honor. And I read her book, and philosophically, what I appreciated and still appreciate about Jane is that she starts from the proposition that residents know best their city. And that they are the ones who should lead the conversation and the planning of a city, not planners or anybody else from above. And she felt this way because of what she'd seen with Robert Moses in New York, who was kind of a totalitarian, really. It's my way or the highway.
Literally.
Literally, yes. In fact, his way was the highway. And she had memorable battles with him. And I think philosophically she's right. Completely agree with her. What's not appreciated about her is that she was also an economist, and she really analyzed city economies through the same lens. For example, she said if you have neighborhoods where people live and work, a restaurant can then have a breakfast trade, a lunch trade, and a dinner trade and be more likely to succeed, as opposed to if you have a cluster that's only for business, then it's only going to have a lunch trade. So she had very interesting from that perspective. However, to get her support, it wasn't sufficient that I agree with her ideas. She basically put me through a grueling interview in which she rather pithily disagreed with some things that I thought were solutions to some of the city's fiscal problems, like getting a share of the federal gas tax. She said, well, it's going to be a declining tax, so why do you want that? And I said, well, I think we can get it, so which we did. But anyway, she became a great ally, but only because she saw someone who shared values. She would not do something politically just for, to be, I don't know, partway there. She really put me through my paces. And she came to some council meetings as well. And this was as she was a bit older, and she was incredibly charismatic at the time because she was hard of hearing. And she brought not hearing aids, but an ear trumpet, which she had made out of paper mache, and it was kind of all these colors and bright green, and she used it to listen to the council debate. There was a photograph of her in the paper, the Toronto Star, the next day. So I'm inspired by her. I'm inspired by her thinking about what an economy really is, and about the fact that residents know their cities best. You do have to make sure, though, if you accept her philosophies, which I do, that doesn't mean that those residents then are in a position to keep everybody else out. So there's a nuance to a way that you have to think about building a city, because her ideas can be misused, I think, to create sort of exclusive neighborhoods where the residents there say, this is fine for us. We don't want change. There's an art to that as a politician. But I think that's my only real caveat. She's made a huge difference in the way people think about cities. It's not just planning for above. It's engaging the residents, listening to them, and helping them build the city they want.
Fantastic.
So, how do you link the citizens with the urban planning or the infrastructure? If they ask you to build a metro system, for example, or a metro line, how do you get that budget? How do you listen to? Do you do everything that they tell you, or how do you exactly deal with the problems of the citizens or their what they want to do for urban planning or architecture in a city?
Well, I guess I didn't get to architects in the last question, but I think architecture has a massive place here. What we tried to do in Toronto to encourage it was to have design review panels on any applications for tall buildings or important public buildings. So the role of the architect was enhanced because it except for big public buildings like an opera house or something like that, it wasn't really thought of in Toronto. So we tried to enhance it. That's just parentheses. I mean, I think the art to engaging citizens is you can't go to people with a project and say, we're doing this, what do you think? You have to go to them at an early enough stage and say, this is what we hope to do.
Mm-hmm.
Does it meet your needs and how we can do it better? So, for example, we revitalized a public housing project, so government-owned housing for low-income people. It's called Regent Park. It was Canada's first public housing project. It was built in the 1950s. So by the year 2000, the buildings were no longer functional and had to be rebuilt. We also realized a historic mistake had been made at the building at the beginning. It was in the middle of a neighborhood and was cut off from the whole neighborhood around it. And what happened over the years was the neighborhood around it gentrified. And so this part became cut off. And although originally designed for returning soldiers, had changed as sort of a settlement area for newcomers. So people were cut off from the neighborhoods around them. No grocery store, no bank, basic things. So we decided that we had to rebuild the roads to reconnect with the neighborhoods around it. So under the advice of the then head of the city housing company, I took his advice and we went to the people who lived there right at the beginning and said, we need to rebuild your housing because it's end of life. And we want to rebuild it by reconnecting the roads. What do you want? We have nothing else. We don't have the plans, nothing. And it was fascinating. People said, we want a grocery store, we want a bank. They also said, we love our neighborhood. We don't want to have to move. And if I get a better job, I'm forced to move out. So I want housing that I can live in my neighborhood that is not rent geared to income, so I can stay, as well as the rent geared to income housing. They also said we want to live in environmentally sustainable housing. Why do we have poor housing? Can't we live in the best environmental housing? And the other thing they said was, we want people from our neighborhood, if you're going to invest here, we want them to work here and get jobs. So we were able to create a project by connecting with them right at the beginning that succeeded. And it could have failed. A lot of efforts to revitalize public housing fail because people, quite understandably, don't want their home demolished. So they fight it. We succeeded because we went to them right at the beginning. And I think, to me, that's the lesson that I took from that experience that applies to many, many things. I hope that responds to your question.
Yeah. And I guess piggybacking off that question, we know you as a former mayor. We know you as someone involved in sort of the highest places in terms of dealing with this crisis. But perhaps we don't know you well enough as David Miller, the citizen, or David Miller, the person. how do you want to be remembered as a person or as a citizen, or perhaps maybe even removing the idea of a legacy?
I mean, I'm not too worried about legacies. I mean, I'm proud of what we did in Toronto while I was mayor. We had a council that supported all of the initiatives I got elected to do, and it was quite transformative for the city. So I'm proud of that. I think, who am I as a person? Well, I started out as a little boy living in a tiny English village where my friends were the sons and daughters of laborers on the farms. And they spoke with a particular accent. And every night I'd come home, and I'm like 4 years old, and my mom said, "You can't talk like a farmer. You have to speak like the Queen, because if you speak like a farmer, that's what you'll be." Because that was England in the 1960s. And they had a test. When you were 11 years old, you took a test. And if you passed it, you could go to grammar school and then maybe go to university. If you failed, you had to go to technical school and get a trade, become a carpenter or plumber or something. At the age of 11, that was decided. Unless you had some money, in which case you could go to a private school and skip the whole system. So my friends' older brothers, I left when I was 9, but only one of them passed. And the rest, when they were 11, it was decided, essentially that they were going to be a laborer. That gave me a keen sense that, something isn't fair and just. And it's what drove, I studied economics to try to understand how things ended up this way. I became a lawyer to try to make things more equitable. Not sure the legal career profession does that, but I had a wonderful career, and that's why I ran for politics. And that's really who I am, somebody whose earliest memories was living this real and obvious inequity based on class. And, my political career was really about trying to make Toronto, which is one of the world's great cities. It's a city of nearly 3 million in a region of 6. It's the economic center of Canada. All the big businesses are there, all the banks, insurance, everything. It's all their head offices. To make that city a place where everyone had a real chance. That's what my goal was. And climate relates to that because it impacts people who have the least the most. So if you can solve it in a way that helps people who have the least, you're making a great contribution. And that's what I tried to do. Was it perfect? Of course not. But, if you grow up where I did, these things are really, really clear. And they still exist. It's more subtle now. But I think it's the hope of governments, particularly city governments, that you can create places where everybody has a real chance. And that's what I think the goal of government should be. And that's what I tried to do.
Fantastic.
I think that was a beautiful story.
Thank you. It's also true.
Of course.
Yeah, so I guess we're out of time, unfortunately, but there are many more questions we would have loved to have asked you, from the broom as a symbol of your political campaign, to sort of other questions we might have had about perhaps how we can get involved in the climate movement.
Well, if I can just speak to that, and first of all, thank you for the podcast. This has been fantastic, and you're obviously incredibly thoroughly prepared, and therefore I assume also excellent students. But I think the truth is, outside of the mayors, and maybe even better than them, who's made a difference in climate? And it is advocacy coming from youth. Greta Thunberg calling out Donald Trump put climate back on the map globally as an issue. And because it was a global issue, it empowered those who were trying to act. And yes, it hasn't been enough. And we have to do more really quickly. But I think the voice of your generation is unbelievably powerful. So, my advice is use your voice. And it doesn't just mean protests like Extinction Rebellion. It means speaking to families, friends, others where you work. This matters, and we got to address it. And your voice is powerful. I also think your vote matters. I mean, this is a political issue. And the truth is the fossil fuel lobby is very powerful. It uses all sorts of means to get its way, massive investments in lobbying, contributions to politicians, and lies. There's a track record of the fossil fuel industry deliberately lying to delay around climate. So voting matters. And voting matters, on this issue more than any in many ways. And, your own actions matter too. I try to live a life that's minimal impact on the planet. But I think the most important thing is your voice and your vote. And if you use those wisely and collectively, it's massively powerful. And it gives us a chance. We've only got a chance now, but it gives us that chance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Miller. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. And we hope you enjoy your copy of Prologue. We also have a little card for you to take home with you on the train. And buy the magazine. It's available online.
I'm looking forward to reading it, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation today. Thanks so much, and good luck, not just with Prologue and not just with your education, but with your careers. The kinds of questions you're asking show you're going to make a real difference, and I wish you both success.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.